Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Emily Vargas. Today, we return to upstate New York, to Rochester and its quiet suburbs, to talk about a series of child murders from the early 1970s that put an eerie pattern across headlines and into the public imagination, the case commonly called the alphabet murders, or the double initial murders. Over 3 years, 1971 to 1973, 3 girls, each about 10 or 11 years old, were abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed. Each girl had matching first and last initials, and each was found dumped near a town that, chillingly, shared that initial. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost made for TV. But, and this is important, the reality is messier, sadder, and still unresolved. So, Marcus, I want to trace the facts carefully and, respectfully. We'll talk about what happened to Carmen Colón, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza, what investigators did at the time, which leads held up, what modern forensics changed, and which questions still sit there, unanswered. Ready?
Yeah. Ready, Emily? Let's do it.
Good. First, quick framing. Rochester in the early 1970s, a mid-sized industrial city on the Genesee River, home to Kodak and Xerox, but already feeling some economic strain, shifts in population, and rising anxieties about safety. Small towns and bedroom communities ring the city: Churchville, Webster, Macedon. And the investigation unfolds in that geography, not a big coastal city with lots of media infrastructure, but a place where community ties matter, and where, at the time, police investigations had limits that feel stark to us now. No DNA testing, mostly eyewitnesses, serology, fibers, hairs. Those constraints shaped what police could do and how quickly the case stalled.
Right. And we should remember, the term serial killer wasn't even widely used then. Profiling was embryonic. Investigators relied heavily on tips, press coverage, shoe prints, hair microscopy, that sort of thing. So patterns could be spotted, but so could mistaken assumptions.
Exactly. That's why the double initial pattern became such a magnet for attention. It's dramatic. Carmen Colón, CC, found near Churchville. Wanda Walkowicz, WW, found near Webster. Michelle Maenza, MM, found near Macedon. 3 girls, 10 to 11 years old, all sexually assaulted and strangled, bodies dumped by roads. But as we'll discuss, the pattern can both illuminate and deceive.
Okay, Emily. Shall we start with Carmen? Let's walk listeners through the first case in detail.
Yes. Carmen Colón, born around 1960, 10 years old in November 1971. Carmen was Puerto Rican, living with family in a working-class Rochester neighborhood. She was a child who ran errands for relatives, ordinary stuff. On November 16, 1971, she was sent to a pharmacy on West Main Street to pick up a prescription for her grandmother. Around 4:20 p.m., she goes into the pharmacy. The prescription wasn't ready. Witnesses later recalled she told the owner, Jack Corbin, something like, "I gotta go, I gotta go." That line, it's small, but it carries a lot of weight. It suggests sudden urgency, right?
Yeah. It suggests either she recognized someone nearby or she felt pressured. And what happens next is, well, terrifying. Witnesses said she got into a car parked near the pharmacy. The vehicle was later described by some as a dark-colored Ford Pinto hatchback, though that description is not ironclad. We have to be careful with vehicle IDs from that era.
Absolutely. About 50 minutes later, and this is one of the most haunting images from the case, multiple motorists on Interstate 490 reported seeing a small girl, naked from the waist down, running along the shoulder of the road. They said she was waving her arms, apparently chasing or fleeing a reversing vehicle, which witnesses believed was a dark Ford Pinto. People saw her, some slowed, some called later, but nobody was able to stop in time. Can you imagine a child, disrobed, running on an expressway and still slipping through the cracks?
It's chilling. Witness memory can be unreliable under stress, but multiple independent motorists seeing something like that adds weight. Then, 2 days after the disappearance, Carmen's body was found near Churchville, about 6 miles from Rochester, partially clothed, sexually assaulted, strangled. The brutality provoked public outrage.
Rochester's reaction was immediate. Law enforcement interviewed hundreds of people. There was a massive public campaign, one that stands out in memory. In early 1972, 5 30 by 12-foot billboards were placed along major expressways in the region. Each displayed an 8-foot photo of Carmen with the question, "Do you know who killed Carmen Colón?" A $6,000 reward was offered, which would be tens of thousands in today's dollars, and an anonymous hotline and a P.O. box were set up. The effort reflected both community grief and the limitations of investigative tools at the time.
There was also scrutiny of family members, including an uncle who reportedly had access to a car and whose behavior raised suspicion in some accounts. He was said to have performed poorly on polygraph tests. Later, he died by suicide in some versions of the story. But he was never charged. It's critical we present that as an unproven suspicion, not a settled conclusion. Polygraphs were and are unreliable, and there's no public DNA tying him to Carmen.
Right. That's an example of how early investigative pressure, combined with imperfect science and media scrutiny, creates long shadows over suspects, even when there isn't conclusive evidence. Okay, then, over a year later, the second child is taken, Wanda Walkowicz.
Wanda was 11, born in 1962, living with her mother Joyce and siblings on Rochester's east side. Described as shy but responsible, she was sent on April 2, 1973, to a delicatessen to buy groceries, the sort of errand an 11-year-old might run in that time and place. Around 5 in the afternoon, she buys the items. Witnesses later saw her walking on Conkey Avenue, struggling with a heavy grocery bag, bracing it against a fence. A brown car is said to have passed slowly by. By 8 p.m., she was reported missing.
The search the next morning was more aggressive. Almost 50 detectives were involved. And at 10:15 a.m. on April 3rd, a police officer found Wanda's fully clothed body at the base of a hillside off an access road to State Route 104 in Webster, about 7 miles from Rochester. The body's position suggested she had been thrown from a vehicle and had rolled down an embankment. Autopsy findings: sexual assault, ligature strangulation, likely a belt, and defensive wounds that showed she fought. Her body had been redressed after death, which is significant. One very specific forensic clue emerged: white cat hairs on her clothing, despite her family not owning a white cat.
That white cat hair detail really stuck in investigators' minds. In an era before DNA, they held on to microscopically observed hairs as clues. White cat hair became a thread investigators tried to follow. Semen and pubic hair were reported in Wanda's case too. But again, the tools to extract individual identification were not available then. Hair microscopy and serology are subjective compared to modern DNA analysis.
And then, months later, in November 1973, Michelle, sometimes spelled Michelle Maenza, aged 10, disappears. She leaves school in the early afternoon, is last seen walking, and witnesses reported a beige or tan car pulling up and the driver talking to or coaxing a small girl who then got into the car. 2 days later, on November 28, her body is found in a ditch near Macedon, about 15 miles east of Rochester. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and her body had been transported and dumped from a vehicle. Her funeral was at Corpus Christi Church on December 1. Her father said, "She was a sweet little girl. She didn't fight much." That quote it's heartbreaking.
It is. 3 girls, similar age, similar method, bodies dumped outside the city near small towns, Churchville, Webster, Macedon. The initials line up, CC, WW, MM. That's the double initial pattern that sparked the label alphabet murders. But as we move into investigation and interpretation, we've got to ask, how much of that pattern is deliberate and how much is pattern seeking by investigators and the media?
Yes, we need to be careful with the psychology of pattern recognition. Humans look for order. It's useful in investigations, but it can mislead. Statistically, children with alliterative names exist. Place names beginning with C, W, M exist around Rochester. But the combination of age, gender, sexual assault, strangulation, geographic clustering, and the double initials does make for a rare confluence. That's the tension. The pattern reduces the odds of coincidence, but it doesn't resolve whether a single killer planned the initials or whether the killer had other motivations.
Let's be concrete about investigative steps. After Carmen, police interviewed hundreds, set up billboards, took tips. After Wanda and Michelle, the FBI got involved, and local agencies started comparing the cases more deliberately, treating them as possibly linked. Forensic materials were collected: semen samples, pubic hairs, ligature marks, fibers, tire tracks. But these were collected in a pre-DNA era, and the evidentiary value was limited.
And that limited value matters. Hairs could be compared microscopically, but that's subjective. Blood typing and serology could exclude some individuals, but rarely identify a single perpetrator. Polygraphs were used to eliminate suspects, an approach we now know is unreliable, especially in pressured settings. And the media's involvement added another layer. Heavy coverage from local papers like the Democrat and Chronicle amplified both accurate leads and rumors, and may have contaminated witness memory. Marcus, was there a major suspect or suspects that investigators focused on?
There were several lines of suspicion. Carmen's uncle, as we mentioned, was an early focus. There were men with prior sex offense histories who were re-interviewed. People who owned similar cars or who had white cats. Those threads appeared. Over the years, various sources named neighbors or men who allegedly showed inappropriate interest. One of the more public speculative links in later years was to Joseph Nasso, a West Coast serial killer, also called an alphabet killer because several of his adult victims had double initials.
Yes, and that comparison led to confusion. Nasso killed adult women in California in the late 1970s through the 1990s. Some of his victims had alliterative names, and he spent time in Rochester early in his life. That made him an attractive figure for amateur theorists and some press pieces to tie to the Rochester child murders. But crucially, DNA testing eventually excluded him in relation to the Rochester cases. Authorities publicly stated he did not match the DNA evidence from the Rochester crimes. So that high-profile theory did not stand up to modern testing. It's an example of how a catchy label can conflate unrelated crimes and mislead public imagination.
That's a good caution. Labels do a lot of work in the public sphere. The 2008 film The Alphabet Killer is another example of fiction refracting the real case. The movie transposes the story into a modern thriller and invents characters and a female detective who unravels psychologically. It borrows elements like white cat hair, but it's largely fictional. The film simplified, dramatized, and altered details, which can be useful as art, but dangerous if people treat it as history.
So, where did forensics eventually get us? Over the decades, some biological evidence from Wanda and Michelle, like semen and hairs, was reportedly preserved. In later years, DNA testing was performed on what remained. A DNA profile was obtained that did not match Joseph Nasso and did not match certain local suspects whose DNA authorities had. But law enforcement has not publicly released a complete picture of what profiles exist or whether they've been run through modern genetic genealogy databases. The case remains officially unsolved. Marcus, do you think genetic genealogy could solve this today?
Potentially. If preserved DNA is of sufficient quality, genetic genealogy, tracing distant relatives through public or permitted genealogy databases, has solved several cold cases. But there are hurdles. The quality and quantity of DNA matter. Experimentation and contamination over decades can limit viability. Legal and ethical frameworks have evolved, and police departments vary in their willingness and ability to use those techniques. So it's possible, but not guaranteed.
And even if a genetic genealogy lead identifies a likely suspect, there are other ethical questions. If the person is dead, does naming them bring closure to families? Does it re-traumatize them? If alive and elderly, what does justice look like after 50 years? These are heavy questions with no neat answers. Let me ask you, Marcus, given the differences in some forensic details between the cases, say manual versus ligature strangulation, degree of beating, do you think it's plausible that one killer did all three?
It's plausible. Serial offenders can vary their exact methods while following the same broader pattern: abduct, sexually assault, and strangle, for example. Differences in postmortem redressing and condition of the body can reflect circumstances: how long the body was exposed, whether the offender had time to stage something, whether different dump sites necessitated different actions. But it's also possible, in theory, that more than one offender operating in the same region targeted similar victims. The weight of age, gender, and corpse disposal similarity argues for a single perpetrator, but it's not conclusive. That's the honest answer.
Honest and sobering. We should also surface the social context. Carmen was Puerto Rican, and we should ask how race and class shaped public reaction and investigation. Did authorities treat Carmen's family with the same sensitivity and urgency as later victims' families? Did media coverage differ? Those are questions worth asking because they affect how cases are solved and how families feel justice, or the lack of it.
Indeed. At the time, Rochester had shifting demographics and rising tensions. Puerto Rican and other immigrant communities alongside long-established white working-class neighborhoods. Marginalization can affect reporting, investigation thoroughness, and community trust. We don't have full public records establishing differential treatment, but the context is important to keep in mind.
Let's pull back and consider investigation missteps. In the 1970s, investigative cultures leaned heavily on local knowledge and tips. The media amplified leads, sometimes contaminating witness testimony. Polygraphs were used to rule people out. And the emphasis on the double initial pattern may have unintentionally shaped investigative focus, perhaps narrowing it. That said, investigators did mobilize resources. The FBI got involved after the later murders, and they never closed the files. They kept evidence, which, to be fair, made later DNA tests possible.
Right. The preservation of evidence is crucial. In many older cases, evidence was lost or degraded. In this case, some evidence survived, at least from Wanda and Michelle. That allowed for later testing and exclusions like the one with Naso. But the absence of a publicly released profile leaves an unsettling vacuum. Families deserve transparency, and the public benefits from knowing where an investigation stands, though there are investigative reasons for withholding some details.
We mentioned Naso already. To be clear for listeners, Joseph Naso was a serial killer in California whose victims included women with double initials, and because he had some early life ties to Rochester, he became a suspect in the public's imagination. But DNA tests did not match him to the Rochester child murders, so that narrative collapsed under forensic comparison. That's an important lesson. Sometimes compelling narrative coincidences dissolve under scientific scrutiny.
Yes. Let me name another point. The significance of small forensic clues like the white cat hair. In Wanda's case, white cat hairs were found on her clothing even though her family didn't own such a cat. That sort of detail can be a powerful breadcrumb. Investigators tried to trace people with white cats, car owners, similar tire tracks, people who lived near the dump sites. But without a genetic match, those clues remain circumstantial. They don't point definitively to a person.
And that's painfully true. The families, the Colóns, the Walkowicz family, the Maenzas, lived with decades of grief, anger, and frustration. They've been subject to intense media interest at times, and to the slow drip of hope and disappointment as leads dried up. You asked earlier what justice looks like 50 years later. I keep thinking about the family's emotional needs, answers, acknowledgement, and perhaps a public record that ties the case to the truth, however late. That's the human bottom line.
I agree. Empathy must guide our curiosity. We can examine patterns and evidence without sensationalizing the pain. The case also changed how the community behaved. Parents kept children closer. Stories of the man in the car entered local cautionary lore, and the fear reshaped childhood routines. Those are real social consequences.
Before we move to wrap up with unanswered questions, Marcus, I want to ask you, what about the possibility that the double initial pattern was not planned by the killer, but was instead something investigators and the media latched onto after the fact? In other words, could the killer have been opportunistic, and the initials are a kind of retroactive theme?
Yes, Emily, that is a real possibility. Investigators and journalists are pattern-seeking. It helps locate suspects. It also makes stories sell. A killer might abduct children who are available, who walk alone, who are vulnerable. If those children happen to have matching initials, a narrative forms. Alternatively, an offender could have noticed the initials and either used them deliberately or retrofitted meaning into their actions. We can't know which without direct evidence or a credible confession. The statistics help us weigh the odds, but they don't provide final proof.
And so we return to our core tension: compelling pattern versus the risk of false closure. To close, I want to leave listeners with the clearest unanswered questions, the ones investigators and families live with. 1. Was there one killer or multiple? 2. How intentional was the alphabet pattern? 3. Did the killer know the girls personally, or was he a stranger cruising familiar routes? 4. Is the killer still alive? And if so, should he be sought for prosecution? 5. Could modern genetic genealogy finally provide a lead? And would the legal and ethical environment permit it? 6. What does justice look like now for the families? Those are the questions that keep this case alive in the public mind.
And I'll add a practical closing thought. If there are people out there who have information, a memory of that era, a car they once owned, a white cat they remember seeing, or anything they never told investigators, time can change people's willingness to talk. Cold tips can matter. Even now, law enforcement says they remain open to new information. So if anyone listening has anything, it's worth contacting authorities.
Yeah. If you're in Rochester and have something to share, do it. We'll leave a list of public resources in our episode notes for people who want to reach out to official channels. And Marcus, before we sign off, a short, reflective question for you. When you look at these 3 cases, what keeps you up about it?
What keeps me up is the silence where certainty should be. The fragments of evidence, the vivid witness reports like the girl on I-490 running naked from the waist down, the white cat hairs, the billboard with Carmen's face asking, "Who did this?" Those images mix with the unknown, the missing motive, the possible conscious pattern, the untraced person who may have driven past neighborhoods for a reason we can't reconstruct. That mixture of vivid detail and yawning unknown, that's what's haunting. It's the feeling that the city still carries.
For me, it's the faces. 3 children whose lives were cut off while their families were left to live with questions. And the thought that modern science might offer answers, but only if the right evidence survived and the will to look persists. Okay, we're going to close with a brief recap and a request.
Go ahead, Emily.
Recap. Carmen Colón, 10, disappeared from a pharmacy errand in November 1971. Motorists later saw a child running along I-490. Her body was found near Churchville. Wanda Walkowicz, 11, disappeared April 2, 1973, after a deli run. Her body was found near Route 104 in Webster, with evidence of sexual assault, ligature strangulation, and white cat hairs on her clothing. Michelle Maenza, 10, disappeared November 26, 1973. Her body was found near Macedon 2 days later, sexually assaulted and strangled. The double initial pattern, CCWWMM, made headlines. Investigators collected biological evidence and other forensic clues, but were limited by the pre-DNA era. Later DNA testing excluded some prominent suspects, including Joseph Nasso. The case remains officially unsolved, and families and community still grieve. Now, our request.
If you have information about these cases, or you're in a position to help investigators with leads from that era, contact Monroe County Law Enforcement. We'll include public contact information in the episode notes. Please, not speculation on social media, but verified, helpful information. And as a broader note, treat these histories with care. These are real people and real families.
Thank you, Marcus. That's all for this episode of Still Unanswered. If you found this episode meaningful, please share it with someone who cares about cold cases done with empathy and rigor. Next time, we'll look at another unresolved story, and, as always, keep victims and families at the center. For Carmen, Wanda, Michelle, we keep asking, and we will not forget. Good night.
Good night. Wow.